Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another 2-Minute Tuesday. Today, we're continuing the conversation about security and performance. In case you had any questions, I want to talk a little bit more about why I'm kind of against using team-based security because, in my opinion, it kills performance. The reason why it kills performance is because the way Dynamics figures out security and how it's applied, it's always by going to the user first. So by you using team member security, you're essentially bypassing, or you're not bypassing, you're executing a step at the user level, checking for business unit, membership, and all of that, and then going to teams. And then once it gets to teams, it needs to figure out what members privilege inheritance you used, how to apply every one of those different settings that you have in here, how does it translate based on that, and imagine if that team has multiple security roles assigned. Some of them have this checkbox or this option, some of them have direct user option. It's just super complicated, and Dynamics will just take forever to go through that. Now, forever might be, a little too much exaggeration, right? But if you use compared to user-based security, it's a lot easier and it's a lot faster. And, again, we've done sessions about this. We've had whole podcasts about this. If you want to go into a lot more detail with it, tune in to episode number 19 of the CRM MVP podcast at crmmvppodcast.com, of course. So, again, as I mentioned last week, this is Microsoft's effort to simplify the way security works. And the other part of it that I didn't mention last week is the dependency in Active Directory groups, all right? So essentially what Microsoft has done, and this is shipping out of the box with Dynamics 365 today, is they have enabled a feature in which when you add a user to Dynamics 365, or through Office 365, let's just say, and you try to connect them to Azure, if you have that connectivity to Azure, especially where people authenticate with your internal Active Directory. If Dynamics and Active Directory can figure out which group, who the user is in Active Directory, first of all, and what users the user belongs to. One of the things that you will find, and let me minimize this. I wasn't planning on showing this, but let's go into Teams right here. Let's just open this team. It doesn't matter which team it is. One of the things you will notice is that the teams, when you enable the synchronization between Dynamics or Office 365 and your local Active Directory, all of the teams will be synchronized. Now they will show up as teams, and they will have an Azure AD object ID for that specific group that they belong to. So groups in Active Directory will now create teams in Dynamics 365. They will be connected. And when you add a user into Dynamics 365, that user, if it belongs to a group in Active Directory, it will also belong to that team. And if those teams have security roles, and especially those security roles have the bypass option or the direct user option, then they all get the security automatically, which is great. It sounds great on paper because it simplifies administration for brand new admins, basically. So I'm adding, Chris from accounting or whatever it is. I add Chris in the system and everything just works. We know that Chris is on this group, which means he's on this team, which means he should get these permissions all automatically. Now, how many people rely on automation when it comes to authorization and access to security? I'm not really sure, but I personally like to have some control because just being part of a group in Active Directory, especially companies that have been using Active Directory for a long time and have who knows what names of groups in there, might not be the best way to do it. So good news is, even though this ships out of the box enabled, we can turn it off. And that's what I'm showing you today. Now, again, this might not be a Microsoft best practice. Microsoft might say that you should rely on Active Directory groups and this whole automation to assign your security. I'm just going to go for the other side that, that doesn't always seem to be the best, option. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using a solution called the Organization Settings Editor. I've featured this this solution here so many times. Sean McNellis, superstar, creating this solution. He works for Microsoft, and it allows us essentially, for those of you who haven't seen any of those videos, it allows us to essentially change settings behind the scenes, essentially, that we don't have a UI for. All right, we just don't have a user interface to get to them. So the setting in question here is called inherited role privileges from team roles. So I'm just going to scroll down to the I, And there it is, inherited roles privilege from team roles. And it's true, like I mentioned, it's enabled by default. And what it's doing is essentially there's runtime calls to Azure Active Directory to obtain what group a user is part of. And so we can match it to a team and do all of that automation that I'm telling you about. In some cases, this can be a killer. And that is because of the capabilities or the ability that we have to host a Dynamics 365 organization somewhere in the world. Like we could have our Active Directory in Boston, let's just say, and have a Dynamics 365 instance hosted in Sydney or whatever, or hosted in Australia. I don't know if there's a data center in Sydney. I believe there is. But anyway, the whole point is if you are hosted far away from where your Active Directories are located, every time you add a user or every time, the security cache is wiped out, and we talked about security cache on that episode 19, so go and tune into that. Every time it's wiped out, I have to go and make these system calls, these runtime calls back to Active Directory to check for group membership and teams and what belongs to what. It's just too much, right? So if you want to turn that off, pretty straightforward. We just go here where it says true. We go to add. Okay, you're going to get a pop-up that says, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. Click on edit, and all you have to do is type in false. Update. Okay. And that's it. So now you have essentially taken Dynamics 365 back to the way it used to be, where Active Directory groups didn't matter, where you essentially are manually driving this thing. I'm big into a philosophy of keep it super simple, right? If you have had Dynamics for a long time and you're already managing it manually since the beginning, you have a process when you have a new employee, how do you grant permissions and all of that. I think that trying to transform everything to automate it and Active Directory groups and all of that can be a big ordeal. I recommend it for some companies, for sure. Look into it. I think it's very, very beneficial. But for some other companies, they need to keep that manual control because not every user that is part of a group in Active Directory should have the exact same permissions in Dynamics 365. And trying to handle all of that, together can be pretty complicated. So once you do that, it's pretty straightforward. It's not like you're going to see this thing go away. It just doesn't really matter. This doesn't really matter anymore. You are turning it off at the system level and you are keeping things simple. You don't have to memorize which security roles have what member inheritance or whatever. You just keep it super simple. So that is today's tip. I apologize that I went over 2 minutes. I just wanted to discuss all of the details. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week.